Hello and welcome back to A Level Biology Help. Today I'm going to take you through the Evolution and Speciation section for AQA A Level Biology. Near the end of the video I'll be going through some exam questions and explaining their mark schemes. And as always there will be timestamps in the comments section so you can skip to the different sections of the video if you do not wish to watch the whole thing. Right, so this is a quick overview of the content that we are going to go over today. So we are going to go over variation in organisms, the effect of selection on allele frequencies, allopatric speciation, sympatric speciation, and then genetic drift. And after that we'll go on to some exam questions. Right, so let's get started. So variation. So there is phenotypic variation within every population, which is due to a combination of genetic and environmental factors. So phenotypic variation is variation that makes organisms look different. So for example, if a cat has long or short fur, which can be due to combinations of genetic and environmental factors. The primary source of genetic variation is due to mutation, which are changes in base sequence of DNA. If you are not confident with how mutations work, go check out my video about meiosis and gene mutations. Mutations produce different alleles, so therefore the phenotype will vary. Another source of genetic variation is random fertilization of gametes, independent segregation, and crossing over, which are the steps in meiosis which create genetic variation. These processes produce what we call recombinant alleles. So alleles recombine to create new alleles. Causes of environmental variation can be disease, predation, and competition. In competition, the organism that has less well-adapted features is less likely to survive and reproduce. We will get onto competition in more detail on the chapter of populations and ecosystems, and also predation, so don't worry about those too much now. So selection, or natural selection, has an effect on allele frequencies. This is because not all individuals in a population can survive and reproduce due to factors such as disease, predation, and competition, like I mentioned earlier. Organisms with phenotypes providing selective advantage, for example giraffes with a larger neck because they can reach the leaves on higher trees, which might be more nutrient dense, are more likely to produce more offspring and pass on their favourable alleles to the next generation. And obviously, with these advantaged organisms, the allele frequencies of them will increase over time. So a change in allele frequencies over time is called evolution. So there are three types of natural selection that you need to know about at A2. At AS, you only needed to know about two types. So I'm just going to go over the first two quickly as you already might know them from AS. So the first one is directional selection, which is when selection favours one extreme phenotype. So as I said earlier, a giraffe neck being long, which would be an extreme phenotype. And it would have this effect on a normal distribution curve. So on the x-axis we have the variation in the trait, and on the y-axis we have frequency of individuals. So if I just get my pen tool out, the original population here is denoted by the dotted graph. So the organisms with the long necks, so these will be about here, because the variation is larger. And obviously, before selection takes place, the frequency of these individuals is quite low, as this might be due to a newly formed allele by mutation or any of the meiotic events that we have mentioned. Obviously, these organisms have an advantage, so their allele frequencies increase over time, which causes the normal distribution curve to shift in the direction of the favoured trait, which is normally to the right. So results in the increase of the favoured allele over time. The next type that you will have already covered at AS is called stabilizing selection, which is when selection favours the average phenotype or allele. And as I said in my AS video about this, an example is birth weight of babies. So obviously babies which have an average birth weight in the middle are more likely to survive because they are less likely to be susceptible to complications. And the effect on the normal distribution curve is that the curve becomes more narrow, as the highest frequency will belong to the average trait. So the next type of selection that will be new to you is called disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is when selection favours both extreme phenotypes or alleles, but at different times due to different environmental factors which might be fluctuating. And it has this effect on a normal distribution curve. So the dotted line here denotes the original population. Selection favours the both extreme phenotypes, so around here and around here. So the allele frequencies of these phenotypes will increase over time. So the evolved population will produce this kind of a M-shaped curve because the frequency of individuals with the average phenotype is decreasing, and the frequency of individuals with both extreme phenotypes increases over time. An example that I like to use to explain disruptive selection is white, grey and black rabbits. So if you have an environment with both black and white rocks, a white rabbit would camouflage against the white rocks, so they will survive, so the allele frequency for the white colour increases. Obviously with a grey rabbit, they will die due to predation, as they can't camouflage between the black and white rocks because they will be easily seen by predators. So this means that they are less likely to survive and reproduce, so their allele frequency decreases over time. And the effect with the black rabbits is the same as the white rabbits. They are camouflaged against the black rocks, so they survive, so their allele frequency increases. So in this case, the grey rabbit is the average phenotype. So the evolution of this population would produce the M-shaped distribution curve as I showed you earlier. However, I'm going to introduce to you this idea of speciation now. Speciation is the evolution of new species from existing ones. And these new species arise when genetic differences due to selection lead to an inability of members of populations to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So genetic differences become more different over time, so much so that eventually members of the population, they can interbreed, but often they produce sterile offspring, so the fertile offspring. Now there are two types of speciation, allopatric and sympatric. So first I'm going to take you through allopatric speciation. So the first step is that the population becomes geographically separated, for example from the formation of a river or a mountain range. So as you can see by the diagram down here, we have the original population, which then becomes split by a geographical barrier, such as a river or a mountain range. These separated populations are unable to reproduce together or interbreed together due to the physical barrier, so they physically cannot reach each other to interbreed. The separate populations have different environments or selection pressures. A selection pressure is basically something that can influence selection, so for example the predators available. So this means that two separated populations will accumulate different beneficial mutations or different beneficial phenotypes or alleles over time to help them survive. This leads the separated populations to have differential reproductive success. So this means that they have different changes in allele frequency to each other. So the final step is that the two populations eventually become so genetically different as a result from their different changes in allele frequency, so that they can't reproduce to produce fertile offspring. And this is called reproductive isolation. This term is also key. So they are now classed as two different species. So now I'm going to talk about sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is when populations become reproductively isolated, so they are not geographically isolated like in allopatric speciation, which could be due to differences in behaviour. So a random mutation could influence reproductive behaviour. For example, individuals are fertile at different times of the year due to mutations or different courtship behaviours. So obviously this will mean that there are massive genetic differences which will lead to them being fertile at different times of year. So obviously the allele frequencies fluctuate between different phenotypes because of this. So this means that particular times of the year individuals will not reproduce together. And over time their DNA becomes so different so individuals are no longer able to reproduce to produce fertile offspring, so are classed as two different species. So sympatric speciation is when they are just reproductively isolated due to differences in behaviour at different times of year caused by mutations. And allopatric is when the populations become geographically isolated, which then leads on to reproductive isolation. So the last idea that you need to be familiar with is genetic drift. Genetic drift is change in allele frequency within a population between generations. So obviously this will be by chance. So by chance a certain allele may be passed on to the offspring just by chance. So it's not due to selection pressures. So continual genetic drift leads to evolution, which are changes in allele frequency and therefore phenotypes and genotypes over time. Now, the most crucial point to remember about genetic drift at A level is that it has a larger effect in small populations, as changes in allele frequency will not have to take place for as long in small populations, as it doesn't take as many generations for the allele frequency to take over the whole population. So genetic drift has a larger effect in small populations as allele frequency changes have a larger impact as less generations are required. So evolution occurs more rapidly in small populations. So here we have an example of genetic drift. So one kind of parent and 3 offspring. So as you can see, there is a random allele changes from generation to generation, which is not caused by selection pressures. So in this offspring, you just have these red squares, and in this one we have a mix, and in this one we just have blue. Right, so that is it for the content, and now I'm going to get on to some exam style questions. So let's look at this first one. On islands in the Caribbean, there are almost 150 species of lizards belonging to the genus Anolis. Scientists believe that these species evolved from 2 species found on mainland USA. Explain how the Caribbean species could have evolved. The first thing to note here is that this is an explain question, so you need to justify why you're writing something, not just what happens. So this question is a big question as it is 6 marks, and it is basically asking you to explain allopatric speciation. So it's kind of just like fact recall but applying it to an unfamiliar situation. So this is what I've written. The 2 original species were geographically isolated. This led to the inability to interbreed due to a physical barrier. Variation due to mutation and different selection pressures occurred, which led to differential reproductive success. So there were changes in allele frequency that eventually led to the inability of the 2 populations to reproduce to produce fertile offspring. So basically here I've just described and explained how allopatric speciation works. So let's look at the mark scheme. The first marking point is geographical isolation. We put that so we would get the mark. Notice how the word geographical is underlined here, so you must refer to the word geographical to get the mark. The second marking point says there are separate gene pools / no interbreeding / gene flow between populations, we put that there is no interbreeding, so we would get the mark. Also, it accepts reproductive isolation, so you could put this to get the mark as well. However, it says here, this mark should only be awarded in the context of during the process of speciation. Do not credit if context is after speciation has occurred. So if you put the term reproductive isolation after you have written 2 species arise, then you do not get the mark. Right, so the third marking point is variation due to mutation, which we put. And marking point 4 says different selection pressures / different abiotic / biotic conditions / environment / habitats. We put different selection pressures, so we would get the mark. So you need to refer to the effect of the mutations on the populations to get the fourth marking point. Here it says neutral, different conditions / climates if not qualified. So as it says neutral, it's technically right, but the examiner doesn't really want you to write it as it isn't scientific enough. And also it accepts named abiotic / biotic conditions. So the fifth marking point says differential reproductive success or selected organisms survive and reproduce. We wrote about differential reproductive success, so we'll get the mark. Also, it accepts pass on alleles / genes to next generation as equivalent to reproduce. So you can put this instead of reproduce to get this fifth marking point. The sixth and final marking point says which leads to a change or an increase in allele frequency. Noting how the word allele here is underlined, so you must refer to allele frequency to get a mark. We wrote about increases in allele frequency, so we would get the mark. So we would get all 6 marks for this question. Also, note that here it says accept increase in proportion / percentage as equivalent to frequency. Right, so let's move on to the next question. So, schizophrenia is a mental illness. Doctors investigated the relative effects of genetic and environmental factors on development of schizophrenia. They used sets of identical twins and non-identical twins in their investigation. At least one twin in each set had developed schizophrenia. So here it says identical twins are genetically identical and non-identical twins are not genetically identical. The members of each twin pair were raised together. So you're probably already thinking this means that all types of twins have the same environment. So the table shows a percentage of cases where both twins had developed schizophrenia. So in this table we have the type of twin, so identical and non-identical, and here we have the percentage of cases where both twins had developed schizophrenia. So in identical it's 50% and non-identical it's 15%. So the first question asks us, explain why both types of twins are used in this investigation. So obviously you need to refer to the fact that identical twins are identical, so they have the same genetic factors. However, non-identical twins have not got the same genetic factors, however, they have the same environments as well as identical twins. So this is what I've suggested. So identical twins show genetic influence, as they have the same genetic factors, and non-identical twins just show the environmental influence. So they can give a bigger indication as to what of an effect environmental factors have on schizophrenia. So let's look at the mark scheme. The first marking point, identical twins show genetic influence / differences between them show environmental influence. So you can put either one of these to get the mark. It says neutral allows a comparison, so it's technically right, but it isn't really specific enough to the question. And also it says it must be clear which set of twins is being referred to. So you can't just put twins in your answer, you need to refer to identical or non-identical twins, so that the examiner is clear on what you have written. The second marking point says non-identical twins also show an environmental or non-genetic influence. We wrote about environmental, so we would get all 2 marks for this question. It says also here must be clear which set of twins is being referred to again, and do not credit repetition of bullet points in the stem. So if you put in your answer the exact same wordings as these bullet points here, you do not get any credit, so you don't get any marks. So let's move on. So the next part of the question asks, what do these data suggest about the relative effects of genetic and environmental factors on the development of schizophrenia? So as you can see by the table, in identical twins, there is a much larger percentage where both twins have developed schizophrenia, which suggests to us that genes play a greater role than environment, as non-identical twins have a lower percentage, and non-identical twins just share their environment, whilst identical twins share their genetics as well. So genes must play a greater role. So if we look at the mark scheme, it says genes play a greater role, or the environment plays a lesser role. Notice how the suffix is underlined here. So this means that the question must be comparative, as the mark scheme says here. So if you just put that genes play a great role or environment plays a less role, you do not get the mark. You need to use comparative terms, so with the suffix And also it says neutral, genes are involved and involves genes and the environment. So these are technically right, but they are not scientific enough or specific enough to the question. So you might not get a mark if you put those points. So let's move on to this question. So suggest 2 factors that the scientists should have taken into account when selecting the twins used in the study. So as this is a suggest question, it just requires your own ideas or your own application of knowledge. So it just says suggesting 2 factors that the scientists need to take into account, so you don't need to provide any explanation. So the factors that I've suggested are age, as this might affect cases of schizophrenia due to different experiences experienced at different ages. And the second point is ethnicity, as ethnicity can sometimes play a role in your susceptibility to schizophrenia. So if we look at the mark scheme, it says here any suitable suggestions for a maximum of 2 marks. So here are a range of points that you could have written. So age, we put this, so we will get 1 mark. Sex of non-identical twins. It says non-identical twins, as obviously identical twins will be of the same sex as they are genetically identical. Family or medical history of mental illness, as obviously if someone in their family has schizophrenia, then they might be more susceptible to it. No use of recreational drugs, as this may lead to a higher risk of schizophrenia, and also ethnic origins, so ethnicity. So we would get all 2 marks for the question. As the question says 2 marks, if you put more than 2 points in your answer, you do not get more than 2 marks. You can only get a maximum of 2. In the mark scheme also it says here neutral environment, as in question STEM, and neutral unqualified ideas such as health or lifestyle. So these are still technically right, however they are not specific enough. And obviously it says neutral environment, as the question wants you to suggest your own ideas. Right, that is all I want to say for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, big or small, please leave them in the comments. I'll be more than happy to answer them, and I'll see you in the next video.